The Muqaddimah, also known as the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun or Ibn Khaldun's Prolegomena, is a book written by the North African Muslim Arab historian Ibn Khaldun in 1377 which records an early view of universal history. Some modern thinkers view it as the first work dealing with the philosophy of history or the social sciences of sociology, demography, historiography, cultural history, social Darwinism, ecology, Darwinism and economics. The Muqaddimah also deals with Islamic theology, political theory and the natural sciences of biology and chemistry. Ibn Khaldun wrote the work in 1377 as the introduction chapter and the first book of his planned work of world history, the Kitabu el-Abar, but already in his lifetime it became regarded as an independent work on its own content. Ibn Khaldun starts the Muqaddimah with a thorough criticism of the mistakes regularly committed by his fellow historians and the difficulties which await the historian in his work. He notes 7 critical issues. All records, by their very nature, are liable to error. Partisanship towards a creed or opinion, overconfidence in one's sources, the failure to understand what is intended, a mistaken belief in the truth, the inability to place an event in its real context, the common desire to gain favor of those of high ranks, by praising them, by spreading their fame. The most important is the ignorance of the laws governing the transformation of human society. Against the 7th point, Ibn Khaldun lays out his theory of human society in the Muqaddimah. Sati al-Hushri suggested that Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah is essentially a sociological work, sketching over its 6 books a general sociology, a sociology of politics, a sociology of urban life, a sociology of economics, and a sociology of knowledge. Scientific method. Ibn Khaldun often criticized idle superstition and uncritical acceptance of historical data. As a result, he introduced the scientific method to the social sciences, which was considered something new to his age, and he often referred to it as his new science, and developed his own new terminology for it. His historical method also laid the groundwork for the observation of the role of state, communication, propaganda and systematic bias in history, leading to his development of historiography. Sociology. Asabiyya. The concept of asabiyya is one of the best-known aspects of the Muqaddimah. Ibn Khaldun uses the term asabiyya to describe the bond of cohesion among humans in a group-forming community. The bond, asabiyya, exists at any level of civilization, from nomadic society to states and empires. Asabiyya is most strong in the nomadic phase, and decreases as civilization advances. As this asabiyya declines, another more compelling asabiyya may take its place. Thus, civilizations rise and fall, and history describes these cycles of asabiyya as they play out. Ibn Khaldun argues that each dynasty has within itself the seeds of its own downfall. He explains that ruling houses tend to emerge on the peripheries of great empires and use the unity presented by those areas to their advantage in order to bring about a change in leadership. As the new rulers establish themselves at the center of their empire, they become increasingly lax and more concerned with maintaining their lifestyles. Thus, a new dynasty can emerge at the periphery of their control and effect a change in leadership, beginning the cycle anew. Ibn Khaldun's model is an instinctive one, not requiring a conceptual social contract present in classical republicanism. Conflict theory. Ibn Khaldun conceived both a central social conflict as well as a theory of the necessary loss of power of city conquerors coming from the desert. Economics. See also Islamic economics. Ibn Khaldun wrote on economic and political theory in the Muqaddimah, relating his thoughts on asabiyya to the division of labor. The greater the social cohesion, the more complex the division may be, the greater the economic growth. Ibn Khaldun noted that growth and development positively stimulate both supply and demand, and that the forces of supply and demand are what determine the prices of goods. He also noted macroeconomic forces of population growth, human capital development, and technological development's effects on development. Ibn Khaldun held that population growth was a function of wealth. Ibn Khaldun understood that money served as a standard of value, a medium of exchange, and a preserver of value, though he did not realize that the value of gold and silver changed based on the forces of supply and demand. Ibn Khaldun also introduced the labor theory of value. He described labor as the source of value, necessary for all earnings and capital accumulation, obvious in the case of craft. He argued that even if earning results from something other than a craft, the value of the resulting profit and acquired must include the value of the labor by which it was obtained. Without labor, it would not have been acquired. His theory of asabiyya has often been compared to modern Keynesian economics, with Ibn Khaldun's theory clearly containing the concept of the multiplier. A crucial difference, however, is that whereas for John Maynard Keynes it is the middle class's greater propensity to save that is to blame for economic depression, for Ibn Khaldun it is the governmental propensity to save at times when investment opportunities do not take up the slack, which leads to aggregate demand. Another modern economic theory anticipated by Ibn Khaldun is supply-side economics. He argued that high taxes were often a factor in causing empires to collapse, with the result that lower revenue was collected from high rates. He wrote, "It should be known that at the beginning of the dynasty, taxation yields a large revenue from small assessments. At the end of the dynasty, taxation yields a small revenue from large assessments." Laffer curve. Ibn Khaldun introduced the concept now popularly known as the Laffer curve, that increases in tax rates initially increase tax revenues, but eventually the increases in tax rates cause a decrease in tax revenues. This occurs as too high a tax rate discourages producers in the economy. Ibn Khaldun used a dialectic approach to describe the sociological implications of tax choice. In the early stages of the state, taxes are light in their incidence, but fetch in a large revenue. As time passes and kings succeed each other, they lose their tribal habits in favor of more civilized ones. Their needs and exigencies grow, owing to the luxury in which they have been brought up. Hence they impose fresh taxes on their subjects, and sharply raise the rate of old taxes to increase their yield, but the effects on business of this rise in taxation make themselves felt. For businessmen are soon discouraged by the comparison of their profits with the burden of their taxes, consequently production falls off, and with it the yield of taxation. This analysis is very similar to the modern economic concept known as the Laffer curve. Laffer does not claim to have invented the concept himself, noting that the idea was present in the work of Ibn Khaldun and, more recently, John Maynard Keynes. The Khaldun-Laffer curve has also been used in solid-state physics and chemistry to interpret the dependence of certain macroscopic properties of solids on hydrostatic pressure. CM Cardona Arxiv, Cond. Mat. 020466 v1. April 29, 2002. Historiography. The Muqaddimah is also held to be a foundational work for the schools of historiography, cultural history, and the philosophy of history. The Muqaddimah also laid the groundwork for the observation of the role of state, communication, propaganda and systematic bias in history. Franz Rosenthal wrote in The History of Muslim Historiography, Muslim historiography has at all times been united by the closest ties with the general development of scholarship in Islam, and the position of historical knowledge in Muslim education has exercised a decisive influence upon the intellectual level of historical writing. The Muslims achieved a definite advance beyond previous historical writing in the sociological understanding of history and the systematization of historiography. The development of modern historical writing seems to have gained considerably in speed and substance through the utilization of a Muslim literature, which enabled Western historians, from the 17th century on, to see a large section of the world through foreign eyes. The Muslim historiography helped indirectly and modestly to shape present-day historical thinking. Historical method. In the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun warned of 7 mistakes that he thought that historians regularly committed. In this criticism, he approached the past as strange and in need of interpretation. The originality of Ibn Khaldun was to claim that the cultural difference of another age must govern the evaluation of relevant historical material, to distinguish the principles according to which it might be possible to attempt the evaluation, and lastly, to feel the need for experience, in addition to rational principles, in order to assess a culture of the past. Ibn Khaldun often criticized idle superstition and uncritical acceptance of historical data. As a result, he introduced a scientific method to the study of history, which was considered something new to his age, and he often referred to it as his new science, now associated with historiography. His historical method also laid the groundwork for the observation of the role of state, communication, propaganda and systematic bias in history, and he is thus considered to be the father of historiography, or the father of the philosophy of history. Ibn Khaldun makes the following comments on his scientific historical method in his Muqaddimah. History is a science. History has a content and the historian should account for it. The historian should account for the elements that gather to make the human history. He should also work according to the laws of history. History is a philosophical science. History is composed of news about the days, states and the previous centuries. Myths have nothing to do with history and should be refuted. To build strong historical records, the historian should rely on necessary rules for the truth comparison. Philosophy of history. Ibn Khaldun is considered a pioneer of the philosophy of history. Franz Rosenthal writes on the Muqaddimah, it can be regarded as the earliest attempt made by any historian to discover a pattern in the changes that occur in man's political and social organization. Rational in its approach, analytical in its method, encyclopedic in detail. It represents an almost complete departure from traditional historiography, discarding conventional concepts and clichés and seeking, beyond the mere chronicle of events, an explanation, and hence a philosophy of history. Systematic bias. The Muqaddimah emphasized the role of systemic bias in affecting the standard of evidence. Khaldun was quite concerned with the effect of raising the standard of evidence when confronted with uncomfortable claims, and relaxing it when given claims that seemed reasonable or comfortable. He was a jurist, and sometimes participated reluctantly in rulings that he felt were coerced, based on arguments he didn't respect. Besides al-Makrizi, Ibn Khaldun's focused attempt to systematically study and account biases in the creation of history wouldn't be seen again until Georg Hegel, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche in 19th-century Germany, and Arnold J. Toynbee, a 20th-century British historian. Ibn Khaldun also examines why, throughout history, it has been common for historians to sensationalize historical events and, in particular, exaggerate numerical figures. Whenever contemporaries speak about the dynastic armies of their own or recent times, and whenever they engage in discussions about Muslim or Christian soldiers, or when they get to figuring the tax revenues and the money spent by the government, the outlays of extravagant spenders, and the goods that rich and prosperous men have in stock, they are quite generally found to exaggerate, to go beyond the bounds of the ordinary, and to succumb to the temptation of sensationalism. When the officials in charge are questioned about their armies, when the goods and assets of wealthy people are assessed, and when the outlays of extravagant spenders are looked at in ordinary light, the figures will be found to amount to a tenth of what those people have said. The reason is simple. It is the common desire for sensationalism, the ease with which one may just mention a higher figure, and the disregard of reviewers and critics. This leads to failure to exercise self-criticism about one's errors and intentions, to demand from oneself moderation and fairness in reporting, to reapply oneself to study and research. Such historians let themselves go and made a feast of untrue statements. They procure for themselves entertaining stories in order to lead astray from the path of God. Quran 31-6. Military history. The Muqaddimah is the earliest known work to critically examine military history. It criticizes certain accounts of historical battles that appear to be exaggerated, and takes military logistics into account when questioning the sizes of historical armies reported in earlier sources. In the introduction to the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun directs this criticism towards two famous historians such as al-Masudi, who is today regarded as the Herodotus of the Arabs, and who Ibn Khaldun himself regarded as one of the most famous historians up until his time. As an example, Ibn Khaldun notes that al-Masudi and other historians reported that Moses counted the Israelite army as 600,000 or more soldiers. Ibn Khaldun criticizes al-Masudi for failing to take into account certain logistics, questioning whether Egypt and Syria could have possibly held such a large number of soldiers, or whether an army of that size would be able to march or fight as a unit. He notes that the whole available territory would have been too small for such a large army, and argues that if it were in battle formation, it would extend several times beyond the field of vision. He questions how two such parties could fight with each other, or one battle formation gain the upper hand when one flank does not know what the other flank is doing, and that a coordinated battle movement in such a large group would hardly be possible. He argues that the situation in the present day testifies to the correctness of this statement, since the past resembles the future more than one drop of water another. He then compares it to the Persian Sasanian Empire, noting that it was far more vast than the Israelite kingdom, and yet the size of the military of the Sasanian Empire at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah amounted to 120,000 troops at most. The Muqaddimah states that if the Israelites really did have such a large army, the extent of their empire would have been far larger, as the size of administrative units and provinces under a particular dynasty is in direct proportion to the size of its militia and the groups that support the dynasty. The Muqaddimah further notes that Moses lived only a few generations after Jacob, the founder of the Israelite tribes, according to the Levite tribe genealogy, as described by al-Masudi. Ibn Khaldun argues that it is improbable that the descendants of one man could branch out into such a number within 4 generations. The Muqaddimah also states that there was a general assumption that Solomon's army was similarly large, but Ibn Khaldun refutes this, noting that Solomon came only 11 generations after Jacob, and argues that the descendants of one man in 11 generations would not branch out into such a number, as has been assumed. He then agrees with another statement from the Israelite stories, suggesting that Solomon's army had 12,000 soldiers and 1,400 horses. He notes that this was when the Israelite state was at its strongest, making other claims giving larger numbers for the Israelite army unlikely. Ibn Khaldun notes that Jews have claimed the unrealistically large increase in the Israelite population within several generations was possible, because it was a miracle of God, a claim that Ibn Khaldun did not dismiss completely. He considers such a miracle highly unlikely, but appears to be open to the possibility.